Hi, I'm Yaakov Katz, and welcome to the Jewish People Policy Institute's Inside Analysis of the state of affairs in Israel and the Jewish world. Today is a solemn day. We are recording this on Yom HaShoah, the Holocaust Remembrance Day. And let me just say that it's a tough one. It's a day that is different this year, since while we are looking back at the attempted annihilation of the Jewish people some 80, 90 years ago, there's a feeling today in Israel that we're just after a recent attempt of our annihilation. And unfortunately, that we're not yet done, as we're still in the midst of the war against Hamas in Gaza. And while I don't accept the comparison some have made to the October 7th massacre as a modern Holocaust, it's far from it. It is understandably hard to look back and reflect when there's so much going on in Israel and so much going on among our enemies who continue to attack us. On today's episode, we have an interview with Michal Cotler-Wunsh, Israel's envoy to combat anti-Semitism. Michal's in Poland right now, attending the March of the Living. She's been there for a few days, visiting the death camps and the Jewish communities who are still there. So we speak to her and get her impressions on Holocaust remembrance, as well as the current modern battle against anti-Semitism today. I'm then joined by JPPI Vice President, Professor Shuki Friedman, and Dr. Sara Hirschhorn, a fellow at JPPI, to also discuss what does it mean in a post-October 7th world to reflect on the Holocaust and to commemorate Yom HaShoah. Lots to discuss. Here we go. Michal, it's great to have you again on the podcast. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us. And we're catching you in Poland as Yom HaShoah, as the Holocaust Remembrance Day is beginning. You are there to participate in the March of the Living. And earlier today, you were at Auschwitz and Treblinka. And I'm curious, you've been working a lot, obviously, since October 7th, on combating delegitimization and anti-Semitism as the special envoy for anti-Semitism. But it seems to me that Yom HaShoah this year takes on for itself a new and different meaning for the Jewish people and definitely for the people of Israel.
Yeah, first of all, thank you, Yaakov, for having me on. And indeed, there is a very, very different feel to this Yom HaShoah, including as we walk around with the thousands, and we've met, the adults and the teens and the university students. I'll mention that I'm also here with the first-time delegation of university presidents. So I'm here as Israel's special envoy. Actually, Canada's special envoy is here as well. And we will be marching with survivors. And we would be remiss if we didn't note that it may be one of the last years that we have the witnesses that are here not only to share their story, but for us to actually take on the memory that they imprint in each and every one of us. And of course, it is different in many ways because of 10/7. So the words never again, and even in the forests, as we sort of imagine the moments in which people are running away from those that are seeking to annihilate them for their identity. There is a whole new dimension to what those two words, never again, mean in a post-10/7 reality. And if I had to share, walking around Auschwitz today, actually, the understanding that never again is about the mechanism that enabled the dehumanization which you witness in Auschwitz, if you will, and the delegitimization of these human beings, not only their lack of humanity in the eyes of the Nazis, but the delegitimization of their very right to exist. And of course, their singling out, or the double standards applied to them as those or as that process sort of took effect, enabling ultimately the atrocities of the Holocaust, the war crimes, the crimes against humanity, the genocide, too terrible to imagine, but not too terrible to have happened, which we bore witness to today in order to carry forward the memory. And the understanding that it is about that mechanism, those 3 Ds, if you will, of the IRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition of anti-Semitism, those 3 Ds that are so critical, because that is the mechanism that enabled the atrocities of the Holocaust, and that is the mechanism to which we must commit to never again allow.
But I agree 100%. And I have to say that one of the things that's really blown my mind as someone who grew up with Holocaust survivor grandparents was this idea that how could people deny that the Holocaust had happened, hearing their stories, going myself to the concentration and death camps, being in Poland, seeing it firsthand, bearing witness, saying it just never made sense. And then comes 10/7, and you see in real time how people have no shame in denying what had happened, right? I mean, how do you, and I know this kind of takes you to what your current role is, but how does that make sense in today's reality?
Well, that is perhaps the most important, if you will, addition, the fourth D. Before those three Ds that I mentioned, denial actually enables the mechanism to repeat itself. It is what is so troubling about what took decades to do systematically with regards to the Holocaust. Not that there weren't deniers, but the systematic denial of the Holocaust as we know it took a long time. Where when we look at 10/7, Yaakov, and this was perhaps the most troubling thing that I was sort of aware of, even as we were chronicling 10/7, the atrocities of 10/7 and the responses to the atrocities of 10/7, was that denial immediately began, even as the 3,000 plus barbaric savages that perpetrated the atrocities of 10/7, fueled by genocidal anti-Semitism, were live streaming the war crimes and the crimes against humanity they were committing. There was already denial. And in this sort of, we have to enter into this social media reality in which we live, right? On social media spaces. And we saw that denial take effect immediately. And that understanding that it is, on one hand, 2024, right? We surely have progressed. And on the other hand, that denial was enabled on that day. And, you know, it struck me that whereas the Nazis were at least aware of the immorality of their actions, they hid what they did, distant from, you know, sort of the human eye, aware, fully aware that this was actually undermining the accepted morality of the time. Well, those that perpetrated the atrocities, the war crimes, the crimes against humanity of 10/7, not only did they not hide what they did, but they live streamed what they did and were exhilarated by their war crimes and crimes against humanity. So there is that overlap, if you will, not only of not having the shame and being exhilarated, but by the immediate denial. That is just an additional element of the challenge that we face. And I do want to say, because 2024 is not 1944. And this has to be very clear. And I've said it in every one of the opportunities I've had to speak here since arriving in Poland. The state of Israel does not exist because the Holocaust occurred. The state of Israel is the nation state of the Jews, a prototypical indigenous people who returned to an ancestral homeland after millennia of exile and persecution, culminating with the Holocaust. But that is not a reparation prize. Israel is not a reparation prize for the murder of 6 million Jews. And in fact, I would say the reverse is true. A Holocaust of the magnitude of the Shoah, as we chronicle it and document it, could not have occurred had the state of Israel existed, had the Jewish people not been a stateless people, in that sense that the mechanism of dehumanization and delegitimization and double standards that enabled their systematic and systemic annihilation in that way, with the intent to annihilate all Jews, because of course not only Jews died, not in Auschwitz and not anywhere else, but the systematic intent to annihilate all Jews that we witness cannot happen, never again, so long as there is a Jewish nation state, of course, that the state of Israel is.
Do you think, though, I mean, you know, there's been a lot of talk, I would say, since October 7th of how this is a modern Shoah. People have used that language, and it's kind of diluted to some extent. I think that particularly this Yom HaShoah here in Israel, we're still in a war, so-called, although things are a bit, you know, winding down, but there still is the state of war. There still are the hostages. It's very difficult to disconnect from the current trauma that you're in to think about the trauma that did happen 80 years ago. And my fear has been, and what I've said to people kind of along the lines of what you just said is, you know, as bad as October 7th was, it was nothing like a Holocaust. We have a state of Israel that a Holocaust can never happen. And as terrible as a disaster it was, no one can annihilate the Jewish people in the state of Israel today. So the the question is more of how do we ensure that this doesn't overshadow what really was this mechanical, systemic attempt to exterminate the Jewish nation?
So the similarity lies in precisely what you just described, Yaakov, in the mechanism, right? I said the dehumanization and the delegitimization and the double standards enabled a genocidal regime, the Nazi regime, to systematically annihilate the state of Israel. Well, if we look at the Hamas charter, but one genocidal proxy of a murderous Islamic regime in Iran, it too committed to the annihilation of the state of Israel. That very intent is there, to annihilate the Jewish nation state and murder Jews around the world, whether it's from Iran or from its proxies, Hamas, Hezbollah, the Houthis, all with the same genocidal intent. Now, the difference being between 2024 and 1944 is, of course, that so long as the state of Israel exists, they cannot actually fulfill the intent of annihilating the Jewish people. But a word of caution to us, with all of that differentiation, is that we should not take for granted the existence of the state of Israel, not even for a moment, because the modern, mutated, mainstream strain, if you will, of Jew hatred, an ever-mutating virus that has existed for thousands of years, for as long as Jews have existed, that modern, mainstream, normalized strain, and we see it on campuses across North America and on the streets and on social media platforms in response to the 10/7 atrocities by a genocidal terror organization. We understand that the demonization and the delegitimization and the double standards of the proverbial Jew among the nations, that is the state of Israel, whether it's in the international institutions, right? Whether it's in the human rights organizations, Me Too unless you're a Jew, whether it's in academic spaces, Zionists not welcome, but now the quiet part said out loud, Jews not welcome into the encampments that are Jew-free, or Zionist-free, if we're still coding the word Jew with Zionist, and the understanding that anti-Zionism has become that modern, mainstream, normalized strain of anti-Semitism that demands that we, first of all, utilize the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance definition, including the 11 examples that allow us to identify and combat all strains of what is an ever-mutating virus. And as we know, actually identifying only partially old or some strains of a virus doesn't help us. And the newer strains continue to infect entire societies, places, and spaces that we allow it to spread. And the one more piece, other than the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism, and that is the word of caution, is that we have allowed this systematic demonization and delegitimization and double standards. I mentioned, right, the 1975 Zionism is Racism UN resolution, Soviet propaganda, alive and well in the name of progress on university campuses. The next blood libel, Israel's an apartheid state, post-2001 Durban Conference Against Racism turned anti-Semitic hate fest. And we are now living, and this is the caution, probably through the most Orwellian inversion of fact and of law that actually troubles me the most, and that is the appropriation and the weaponization of the Holocaust itself, of the term genocide, coined by Raphael Lemkin to describe those atrocities, utilized, weaponized to charge the state of Israel of genocide, even if as it defends itself from a genocidal terror organization that attacked it on 10/7 in none other than the International Court of Justice, and of course then spread and peddled by all the other organizations and so on across campuses and in social media spaces.
And as we speak, we're waiting to hear if the ICC is also going to be issuing warrants against some of the leaders, the political leaders and military leaders. Michal, we're talking also on the day that the Tel Aviv University and ADL issued a report showing a worldwide surge, a 400% almost increase in anti-Semitic incidents in France, 100% in the US, over 100% in Canada. You had mentioned the IRA definition of anti-Semitism, which a lot of states and some NGOs have begun adopting, but I also saw you speaking out before of the need for IRA to update its definition for the way it is until now, not satisfactory or not enough for the modern incarnation of what anti-Semitism is.
No, so let me clarify, and perhaps I wasn't clear enough. The IRA working definition is the benchmark definition. Post 2001 Durban Conference Against Racism, it is precisely the process that defined anti-Semitism in the most comprehensive manner, including the 11 examples and all of the strains that currently exist of anti-Semitism, including not the criticism of the State of Israel that the IRA clearly stipulates is not anti-Semitism, but its delegitimization, the negation of its very right to exist. The IRA working definition is the benchmark definition, and we have to be very clear. The result of a very long democratic process that's been adopted by more than 40 countries, by more than 1,200 entities. If you saw any criticism from me, it's about the lack of implementation of the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism. It's insufficient to just adopt it. So the first step is, of course, to adopt it, because we cannot identify. And
that Holocaust education needs to include it, right?
That's right. Holocaust education has to include contemporary anti-Semitism, using the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism, because the threat of only Holocaust education without the contemporary strain of anti-Semitism or the comprehensive definition of anti-Semitism actually threatens the Holocaust and genocide, as we see being weaponized to accuse Jews / their nation state of perpetrating a Holocaust, of perpetrating a genocide, without understanding that that is the modern strain of anti-Semitism listed in the IRA as the definition, as part of the definition, not the definition, but part of the definition. And the one more thing that I would like to say about the importance of IRA is that in many spaces, the pushback, including the conversations with university presidents, those that, were at the hearings in Congress, many others that were not at the hearings in Congress, the importance of understanding that in order to tackle anti-Semitism in all of its strains, that doesn't mean that all Jews or all non-Jews need to self-define as Zionists. It does not. But it means that all Zionists deserve the very same protection of whatever rules we have, whether it's the DEI infrastructure in universities and others, deserve the very same protection as those that define in any other way, including as anti-Zionists. And singularly, the IRA working definition of anti-Semitism can be utilized. It is a resource. It is a tool. And as we said before, if you can't define something, you don't know how to identify it. And if you don't know how to identify something, you can't combat it. So it is the first step, not the last step. The first step, adopting the IRA definition, of course, implementing it is the next step that is critical to be able to identify and combat comprehensively what we see as this tsunami that you described. And, when you say 400%, we have to know that it is underreported. We know that there are hundreds of underreported cases, including by university students that feel that, regardless, the administrators won't do anything about it, on social media spaces that feel like the social media spaces will regardless do nothing about it. And certainly across the international law institutions that regularly demonize, delegitimize, and apply double standards to the single Jewish state in the family of nations. And therefore, it is actually the first step in all of those spaces and places where the tsunami of anti-Semitism, unfathomably in response to the atrocities of 10/7, has been on this incredible, unbelievable rise in response to the attack, the war crimes, the crimes against humanity by genocidal terror proxy in Israel. And I think that that's also a moment of reckoning for us as a people. I think that perhaps for the first time, Israelis understand what anti-Semitism is.
Right.
And I think that in many ways, across, the world, Jews living throughout the world, certainly North America and the United States, that thought that perhaps they can shed their Zionist pound of flesh in order to be good Jews or good people, have had their moment of awakening too. And it is actually a critical moment of conversation for us as a people, reclaiming precisely what we are, a people returned to an ancestral homeland. Not all of us live in it, but Israel as that nation state of the Jewish people. This is a moment of reckoning as we enter the fourth quarter, if you will, of Israel's sort of towards our 100th year, as we sort of usher in this fourth quarter of the miracle that is the state of Israel, the conversation that we must have as a people about the way we educate our own children, about the reclamation of identity and understanding what it means to be a Jewish nation state, about the reclamation of Zionism and Zionist as integral to the identity, not only of majority Jews, but as the identity for thousands of years in the prayers and longing and yearning to return to Zion, as we just read in the Haggadah, that we have read for thousands of years. In many ways, as awful and as challenging as this moment is, it really connects us to what we've come to call these 10 days between Yom HaShoah and Yom HaAtzmaut, Aseret Yemei Tikva, the 10 days of hope, with a reminder of the late Rabbi Sachs of what hope is, and differentiated from optimism, hope as being something that requires that we gather, that we together are able to make things better, as hope as a very, very active virtue that requires great courage. And indeed, this is an existential moment of challenge that requires moral clarity and courage, enabling to reach across real or perceived differences of geography, of denomination, of politics, of religion, and actually finding allies with which we know we must have no subject of hatred can actually fend off or fight off the hatred of any kind of racism or bigotry alone. And in that sense, internally, it's a moment that we gather and create this opportunity for conversation, and also in reaching across differences in order to create allyships with those that understand that this indeed is a threat not only to the Jewish nation state, not only to Jews around the world that are attacked as a result of the attack on the Jewish nation state and the war that is raging, but in fact to our shared humanity that on 10/7, like on 9/11, our shared civilization, our humanity attacked by barbarism is something that has to be made very clear in this context as well.
Michal Cotler-Wunsh, thank you so much for joining us from Poland, and for being there representing the Jewish people in the state of Israel. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for having me, Yaakov.
So Shuki, we're talking about this idea of, post October 7th, Yom HaShoah, Holocaust Remembrance. And obviously it's naturally something that's a little difficult, right? People have a little more of a harder time being in that mood that we're usually in on a day like today in the state of Israel, because we're all asking ourselves, are we going into Rafah? Are we not going into Rafah? Is there a deal? Is there not going to be a deal for the hostages? How do you see this?
Before jumping into the question of how do we see the Holocaust today and what is the perspective we got since 7th October to the Holocaust, I want to share a personal memory with your permission.
Sure.
I'm named Shuki, is standing for Yehoshua, and I named after my great-grandfather, Yehoshua Gross, who had been murdered in Bergen-Belsen just 4 weeks before the camps been freed by the US Army. And here you can see his picture. He actually been 47 when he's been murdered by the Nazis over there. And every year I'm trying to make the Holocaust Remembrance very personal for me as a grandchild, for survivors from Auschwitz from all sides, and for someone that lost many members of his family in the Holocaust. I'm trying to remember who could we be. My children had a grandfather and grandfathers. My parents didn't have any.
Right.
And we didn't have any. And it's a national Remembrance Day, but also very personal for me and for many others. Just lost peers and family back in Auschwitz and other camps. Now, when you have a perspective for this, you understand that we are in a completely different situation. Another personal story, when I served in the army, my grandmother talked to me about the service, and I had a dilemma of whether I should go to the officers course. And she told me, when we've been in Auschwitz, we've not volunteered into anything. And really realized that her experience of life, which had been extreme experience of life when she'd been 17, 18, my age then, was to prevent or jump in and lead. And we're in completely different situation today.
Right.
Talking about 7th of October, we're talking about draft today. We have a huge, strong, sophisticated army, enable us to respond and protect the people back in the south, in the north, in 7th of October. And it's true that not everything worked well, and unbelievable number of people being murdered cruelly by Hamas, but still, after 3 hours, 4 hours, being army units and civilians with weapons protecting the Jews for more severe situation, more severe massacre over there. And the difference between our people today, in our situation today, the Israeli people, and the Jewish people around the world is traumatic, because then no one had been there to protect us. Jews could pray and cry, but no one heard. And today we enable to protect ourselves, enable to respond, and we're still regional superpower and economic power. And if we have a perspective, we are in very difficult time, and challenges are mounting around the corner and back in the recent months. And we lost many dear to us, including members of the family and friends. But there's a huge difference. We are in a peak of the Jewish history. Still, we have very strong regional power and world power. And by a few months, in a perspective, will be in complete, I hope and believe, will be in completely different situation.
Yeah, no, you reminded me a bit of a different story, but my grandmother, who spent about 2 years in Auschwitz. So I remember once as a kid, one of my first cousins asked her, "Bubby, did you ever go to camp as a kid?" And of course, my grandmother would never miss an opportunity. My cousin was asking about, summer camp, because she was about to go off to some summer camp. My grandmother decided to give an answer about the camps that she had been to, which were slightly different than the summer camps, obviously, that my cousin was talking about. But obviously, the different experiences that we all carry with us. Sara, being here, obviously, and you're here now in Israel, visiting professor. You've probably been here before on Yom HaShoah, but obviously this is a very different one. I'm curious for your take as somebody who just very recently has now moved to Israel, but being here during, obviously, the experiences of October 7th, but also this Yom HaShoah, which is a very, very different one.
If I am also allowed to speak personally, I have a somewhat different story in that even though my last name is a German name, my most recent ancestor left Poland after World War I. So almost my entire family, or my closest family, had come to the United States prior to the Holocaust. So most of my family, or my nuclear family, are not Holocaust survivors. But today, I guess I reflect on Yom HaShoah differently, because it seems to me that the next great hatred of the Jewish people has come to the United States, which my family saw as a safe harbor and as a place that would be free of the kind of anti-Semitism that perhaps some of their more distant ancestors perished from in Europe. So I look at Yom HaShoah today, being here in Israel, and agreeing with Shuki that the difference between being an Israeli or living in Israel and being in the United States is that you live in a country here where you have an army to protect the Jewish people. In the diaspora, we are still reliant on the good faith of the foreign powers under whose rule we live. And we are, I think, seeing before our own eyes the limitations of reliance on the communities upon which we have lived in the diaspora. And it certainly marks a significant difference, even in the shadow of October 7th, which was such a dramatic breach of Israel's national security and the sense of safety that the Jewish people may have had living in Israel. Yet I think we see very significant differences between what it's like to live in Israel and what it's like to live in the diaspora this Yom HaShoah.
100%. And I think that, Shuki, going back to what you were saying before, something that's always, and not necessarily just in Yom HaShoah, not necessarily just after October 7th, but I think that in general, you know, we obviously misjudged and misevaluated, of course, misread Hamas and its capabilities and its intentions, and that's how October 7th happened to a large extent. But I feel that also we have, at the same time, allowed for politicians mostly to instill within us this fear that we're weak and we can be destroyed, and to use that for political purposes, when really, kind of what you were saying before, we are at a peak in Jewish power like never before in the state of Israel. Forget about the United States for a moment, or outside of Israel. And comes with that also a different type of state of mind that maybe we should be having.
Israel got used to solve problems quickly and smoothly. And when you confront Hamas and terror, like the kind we're confronting now and for recent years, actually, talking about the Hezbollah in the north, and the militias, Iranian militias now in Syria and the east, the Houthis jumped into this mixture. Basically, there's not one solution, a quick solution to this challenge. And then the feeling of many Israelis that we are failing to confront the situation, and it's true that we not yet they eliminate Hamas and the hostages are still there, and it takes time. But if you take a perspective, look, for example, at the Iranian attack against Israel, the way Israel managed to contain it together with allies in the region and international US and Britain and others, but the way we have done it is tremendous. So we have the capabilities, we have the technology, we have a very strong army. And if you take a perspective in a peak, it doesn't mean that we can solve all problems immediately. And the question of getting into Rafah or not is still upon our decision in the next few days. And if we go to Rafah, we might pay more prices, unfortunately, and suffer more casualties, because this is a war being forced upon us since the 7th of October. But still, if you take the 100 years and 1,000 years of Jewish history, I think that never before Jews have been so strong and capable of stand in the challenges like we are challenging now with confronting with regional power. And I think basically many, not necessarily more than ever, but many enemies, terror organizations, other powers want to eliminate us, and still able to hold this Western post here in the Middle East, sustain and prosper economically and culturally and so forth. So I think the mood, and it completely understood, is quite low. And I see my friends and family feels, shallow, and it's hard days. But still, if you look back and if you look to the future, I see a much more clear future and horizon for Israel. And it will take time, but it is upon us to be resilient, determined, and to get there.
So, Sarah, on that note, while we can be stronger, we are facing greater challenges, right? And the challenges aren't just along our borders with the different fronts that we are fighting on, whether it's the Houthis or Hamas or Hezbollah or even direct attacks from Iran, but it's also what we're seeing across specifically college campuses at the moment, but all across the US. The ADL report just from the other day talking about a 400% increase in anti-Semitic attacks and incidents in France, 100+% increase in the United States, 100% increase in Canada. I mean, anti-Semites are having a field day right now, right? They're having fun. And when we look back at the Holocaust and what's going on today, it's as if not much has changed to some extent.
Well, I think the advent of Jewish power has obviously changed the equation. Today, there's a state of Israel that speaks, on behalf of the Jewish people. Sometimes not always to its, to its advantage. Sometimes to its detriment. but certainly, represents military power that would prevent another Auschwitz. But I do think that we are losing the battlefield of the media wars. And I've learned from you only this week that, oftentimes the ability to conduct public diplomacy is limited and fragmented, and that even the best, best public diplomats can't explain bad policy away. But I think there is a severe challenge, and diaspora Jews need to think about what their options are going to be to ensure their safety and security going forward. And this may mean some painful choices that are not necessarily only about relocation to Israel, but about the kind of institutions where they want to invest their energies, and developing, more internal focus to their activities than they have in the past. I think the age of allyship maybe is over, or that the diaspora Jews need to look for different kinds of allies that they may have had in the past. Maybe not those that might have been their first political preferences, but those who will stand behind the safety and security of Jewish people in the diaspora going forward, and to evaluate, where the best place for their energies are in this new reality where anti-Semitism has not disappeared. In fact, it's only grown stronger. But the reality after Auschwitz is that Jews are not going to satisfy their critics by dying. They want to live and they want to have a future, and there may be some painful choices ahead in thinking about what a new life looks like for diaspora Jews as well as for Israeli Jews.
It's fascinating. And, even for people who might have listened to the episode that I did a couple weeks ago with a student from Colombia, we speak about, for example, how I think her own siblings and friends want to go there next year. And it's not no, we shouldn't send kids there. It's that, yes, we have to double down and actually continue to go there. There's a wake-up call, but it might not be the wake-up call that we think people should be having. Shuki, I wanted to ask you, before we wrap up, there's always been a lot of talk about the fight against anti-Semitism, of the role that Israel should be playing, right? And I think that we need tzniut here, right? Humility of what can we actually do and what can we affect, and whether, it was like the best example to some extent that a lot of people had a field day with was Prime Minister Netanyahu's video that he put out around the protests on the college campuses, comparing it to the 1930s in Germany. And there were people who were saying, Mr. Netanyahu, you are the problem, right? I mean, your video is not what's going to help. You are part of the problem. And so I wonder how you see it, because there's the diaspora ministry, and they're also in charge of combating anti-Semitism. Is there something more that we in Israel can be doing to help with the situation?
The answer is, of course, yes, but there are actually two questions. First of all, what is our responsibility as a Jewish people towards Jews around the world and combating anti-Semitism? And then what can we do? The answer to the first question is, of course, not only that we've been established to be a shelter or a safe place for the Jewish people, but also we've been established the Jewish state to be able to protect Jews around the world. And Israel took this responsibility upon itself by a basic law, which is a constitutional law in Israel, saying that it's responsible to the safety of every Jew around the world, Israeli or non-Israeli. So the responsibility by law and by moral is there. Now the question is what effective to do, and here it's more sensitive because basically we expect at least the Western country, but other countries around the world to protect Jews under their sovereignty, and basically the responsibility of protecting minorities, including Jews, is on US government administration and Western and European administration and so forth. So basically, it's not only our duty, but what Israel can do is to work in few channels. First of all, through governmental channels toward European countries and other countries where there is a problem of anti-Semitism, to make them or to push them to be more determined in combating anti-Semitism in all ways possible, education, enforcement, and so forth. And there are more channels we can work through. But basically, as a state of the Jewish people, we definitely have the responsibility to verify that one Jew around the world is suffering from anti-Semitism, whether it be in campuses in the US or on the street of Paris and London.
Sarah, anything to add on that question of the role that Israel should play?
Look, I think, again, I agree with both of you that modesty here is required, because the state of Israel, I think, might first priority be to put its own house in order in various ways that would affect its standing in the world, and the way other Jews around the world are, often associated with the behavior of the state of Israel. But at the same time, I think Israel was created, as Shuki said, as a safe harbor for the Jewish people, and always has that responsibility to look out for Jews, not only in encouraging them to come to Israel, but also to assist them in making their lives in their current nation states a safe and I think thriving existence, not just one where their security is at stake, but also one where Jewish institutions, Jewish identity, Jewish culture can thrive for the future.
Right. Very interesting. Well, thank you both, Shuki and Sarah, and Michal earlier, for joining us. Wishing everyone a meaningful and memorable Holocaust Remembrance Day. Important to, despite everything that's going on, to take that moment to remember, whether it's family members, as Shuki shared with us the story of the person he's named for, or just the collective of the Jewish people and what we've been through and the challenges we face. Thank you very much for joining us, and you can find us again on Thursday for another episode of the JPPI's Inside Analysis.